So I want to explore some trends of patient safety in the ICU, specifically adverse events. So before we get started with all of the data and the numbers, I want to ground us in a definition of adverse events, because I think there's some misunderstandings and different ideas about what those are. So adverse events are unintended negative consequences due to healthcare. The important parts there are that they're unintended and that they're due to the care that is being provided and not the underlying disease processes of the patients. And adverse events are very costly to patients and the healthcare system. Adverse events are very common in hospitals, so about 8% of hospital admissions will be associated with an adverse event. And kind of the infamous study from the Institute of Medicine of the United States in 2000 identified 98,000 preventable deaths occur each year because of adverse events in hospital. So as I was saying that, in 2000, the Institute of Medicine out of the United States came out with this kind of pivotal study trying to call to arms a focus on patient safety. And since that time, we can see here, this is a graph from a systematic review that we did on hospital adverse events, that in the gray bars, this is the number of publications that have come out around hospital safety. And the blue line is the pooled estimates of adverse events over time. And you can see since the publication of the Institute of Medicine's report in 1999 or 2000, there's been an increase in the number of studies looking at patient safety in hospitals. But unfortunately, there's also been an increase in the number of adverse events occurring in hospitals. So this investment in safety and interest in patient safety in hospitals hasn't resulted in a decrease in adverse events over time. So as I mentioned, there are considerable preventable deaths related to adverse events, and they also cost patients their health, but they're also costly to the healthcare system. So this study out of the Netherlands looked at the excess cost of adverse events and found that when a hospital admission has an adverse event related to it, there is an increase of over $7,000 US compared to admissions where there is not an adverse event. So can we predict who might have an adverse event? So we know that fairly consistently in the literature, older patients who have multimorbidity and severe illness are more likely to have an adverse event in hospital. And this sounds an awful lot like the majority of patients in the ICU. So we are interested in looking at adverse events in critically ill patients. And we did this by searching the literature. So we built it off a previous systematic review we did looking at hospital adverse events and then updated it to include more recent publications. We found that a lot of patients in the ICU are having adverse events. 25% of patients admitted to the ICU had an adverse event during their admission, which equates to 8.5 adverse events per 100 patient days. And similarly to the trend that we saw in hospital adverse events overall, the adverse event rate over time has been fairly stagnant. It might look like there's a slight increase over time, but if we look at the confidence intervals, there's no significant trend there. So what type of adverse events are happening in the ICU?
Sorry, but the slides don't move again.
Oh, really?
Same slide. Yeah.
Can you see the slides if I just do it that way?
Factors associated with adverse events.
Yeah.
And type of adverse events.
Okay, so I apologize. It's going to be a little smaller than intended. So what type of adverse events are happening in the ICU? So this graph looks at the evidence around the type of adverse events. And in the absence of a taxonomy about the type of adverse events, there's no clear way of classifying the type of adverse events. There's quite a few different ways that they are reported, and not always all adverse events are reported. So the blue bars represent the number of studies that investigated these type of adverse events, and the orange line is the number of adverse events by type. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of things here. So drug adverse events are the type of adverse event that are most commonly reported on. And I think we'll hear a little bit more about that very shortly. Other commonly reported adverse events are nosocomial infections and respiratory complications. But when we look at the prevalence of adverse events in the ICU, the most common was this category called care provision. And this is kind of a all-encompassing term for anything related to planning and executing the care of patients in the ICU. Other commonly occurring adverse events are infections, nosocomial infections, and delirium. So again, is there any way of predicting who might have an adverse event when they're in the ICU? Similar factors, we found similar factors in ICU patients as in the general hospital population. So patients who are older, patients who have more severe disease, often measured by the SAP and organ failure. And then in terms of the actual course in the ICU, if patients are admitted urgently from the OR or transferred from another unit, they were more likely to have an adverse event. And probably not surprising to very many people in this audience that if patients had invasive interventions during their ICU stay, they were also more likely to have an adverse event. And what are the consequences of having an adverse event in the ICU? Well, it increases ICU length of stay, and patients who have an adverse event during their ICU stay are more likely to be readmitted to the ICU and die before leaving the ICU. So I don't know if this is the good news slide or the bad news slide, but almost half of adverse events that occur in the ICU are preventable. So the bad news is we could be doing a better job. The good news is that there's an opportunity to improve the safety of patients in the ICU. So what opportunities? How can we find ways to improve safety in the ICU? So two kind of contradictory and polar opposite approaches can be taken to try and improve safety. So the first is looking at targeted interventions that kind of hit this low-hanging fruit. So we do know that some type of, from the literature that we reviewed, that some types of adverse events are more preventable than other types of adverse events. So a study by Forster and colleagues found that therapeutic errors were more likely to be preventable than some other types of adverse events. So maybe focusing on adverse events that are more preventable could yield some improvements in safety. We could also target commonly occurring adverse events. So example, we found that nosocomial infections were a fairly commonly occurring adverse event, and a study by Provost had some targeted interventions to decrease nosocomial intervention that were highly successful and were maintained for over a year, 18 months. So those are some examples of targeting high-risk circumstances. We can also take a more broad approach, which kind of touches on what Dr. Sauro was talking about before, looking at culture. So this is a budding area of research in patient safety in hospitals, but also in ICUs. So improving patient safety culture can really improve adverse events and safety in ICUs, but also hospital in general. And something that, again, it's kind of top of everybody's mind right now is burnout and capacity, given the high demand on ICU resources right now. So there's a Harvard work hour study that found by changing work hours, they were able to decrease adverse events by 22%. So that's one example of kind of larger interventions that can improve patient safety. We also found in one of our other studies that when patients are transferred from the ICU to hospital ward, if they're transferred on a day where the ICU is at 80% capacity or greater, they're more likely to have adverse events. So there's some kind of large scale interventions that can target those areas of patient safety as well. So kind of the take home message is that adverse events are still very common in the ICU. 1 in 4 patients will experience an adverse event. They are preventable, so there's a great opportunity to use what we already know to target interventions to high-risk issues and circumstances and improve safety culture. So just kind of my closing remark is that we can't be comfortable with the status quo. We need to build off of existing knowledge to redouble our efforts to improve patient safety. And a quick acknowledgement to Dr. Stelfox, who co-wrote the paper with me.